The Civil War may have been an unavoidable war. Many things led up to the Civil War, which were events that pushed each side, the North and the South, closer to wanting to go to war. A major question being asked is whether it was preventable or not. Some would say it was, and some would say it wasn't, but the war did happen, and this will go over the events leading to the Civil War. When the Industrial Revolution started, it was the beginning of America's boasting economy. Railways had improved, allowing goods to be shipped farther and faster. Also, many immigrants were coming over to the United States for work, even though pay was very little. Many technologies were invented at this time, too. With increasing factories being opened, a lot of new machines were created at the time. Textile and iron industry were really booming. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, many things were made in homes with simple tools, but as the country became industrialized, it mass-produced things using large machinery. The antebellum period was the time right before the war. Many things in this period were actually much of the cause of the war. During this period, the government had begun gaining a lot of power. This is also one of the reasons the South seceded from the Union. Also, this was a time when the United States developed a real military. The main thing about this period was that slavery was a huge debate. The South needed slavery for farming, but the North did not agree. This was one of the main points leading up to the Civil War. Also, with the invention of the print and press, it allowed articles created by women to begin being published. A lot of women were upset with the work conditions in factories. They began speaking out a lot more about women's rights and protesting. A major social reform was the treatment of equality. Many people were beginning to protest how the lower class and working class individuals were being treated at the time. A lot of people found it unfair that they were put to such brutal labor force under horrible conditions. A big social reform was women's rights. Abolitionism also was a big thing that started. It rose a lot of emphasis on race equality. In the abolition movement, the main goal was to emancipate all of the slaves and end racial discrimination. Advocating for immediate emancipation set them apart from the normal anti-slavery supporters who believed in gradual emancipation. Slowly, the abolitionists demanded more, and this began to create a larger rift between the northern abolitionists and the southern slave owners, which is what slowly pushed the country towards war. In this time period, industry was growing. The culture also began to change from what it was in earlier times. Women started getting jobs in factories and being some of the providers in the household. Along with this came the social discrimination of women. Women who were working, or even women who were not working, were facing serious discrimination. In the workplace, women faced horrible conditions in factories. They were around dangerous machinery and often hurt themselves, as well as they could sometimes be locked in their workroom for their entire shift. Hours for women were long with very low pay. They got paid a lot less than men, mainly for the fact that they were women. They also faced discrimination in public in the fact that they were looked down upon as lesser. Socially, riots broke out and there was much protest at the time. There were a few differences between the North and the South at the time. Socially, there were some big differences. The North was more interactive because it had big cities where people had more interaction on the daily. The South, however, was more spread out. Farm plantations were spread out far from each other, and this led to a more independent lifestyle. Economically, the South thrived on mostly farming as their soil and climate was good for it. The North, however, continued to industrialize, and they thrived off of a lot of trade and shipping and industry. Culturally, there were huge differences. Because the South thrived on mainly farming and agriculture, they needed a lot more labor work. This resulted in the use of slaves, and the North disapproved a lot in the use of slaves, as they also didn't need them. The North's lifestyle was a lot more fast-paced, too. They had work time and schedules they had to meet as a result of the type of jobs due to industrialization. There were a few different strategic aspects to the war. Some aspects would be that the North would go to the war with the more developed and advanced weaponry, while the South would go in force and in numbers. Technologically, the North had a much bigger advantage over the South. They were a lot more industrialized, which helped them with weaponry and better technology. However, the South had a better social advantage over them. The South wanted strongly to continue to use slave labor because they needed it for their economy. The strong want to keep what they had is what socially united the South and pushed them through the war. Abraham Lincoln had a strong influence over the Civil War. Lincoln was a man who strongly felt for what he believed in. Slavery was one of the things that he was strongly against. Being that he was a strong leader, he managed to execute his plans to abolish slavery slowly. His leadership skills and plans during the Civil War is what led the North to victory eventually. It was also him who passed the 13th Amendment, abolishing it. His leadership and dedication for all he did was a great mindset for the Union as a leader. There were a few impacts of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The immediate effect of the 13th Amendment was the abolishment of slavery. The 14th was a major one because it gave all free slaves citizenship. But more importantly, it has come to pass that the U.S. Supreme Court has forced all states and local governments to justify every law that gets challenged. The court can strike down any law that they don't see as necessary. Lastly, the 15th was hardly noticeable. One of the Reconstruction plans were the Black Codes. These codes, which ranged widely in severity, outlawed everything from interracial marriage to loitering in public places. These Black Codes were very harsh as well as degrading to blacks and limited their rights although they were free citizens. After radical Republicans took over, they started on the Radical Reconstruction Plan. The first Reconstruction Act was passed in March 1867. The bill reduced the secessionist states to little more than conquered territory, dividing them into 5 military districts, each governed by a Union general. They also declared that Southern states must redraft their constitution to ratify the 14th Amendment. To further safeguard voting rights for former slaves, Republicans passed the Second Reconstruction Act, placing Union troops in charge of voter registration. In the U.S. after the Reconstruction Acts, African Americans were affected greatly. One of the main Reconstruction plans that had been implemented had been the Black Codes. Much of what the code said stated that blacks had to be in service to white people, they could not have congregations together, they couldn't speak out, and they could not have weapons. It also said that blacks could not go without a white supervisor. All of these things made life much harder for African Americans in the South. In conclusion, the Civil War was an unavoidable war. The clashing views of the North and the South is what drove them to split and fight. In the end, the Union came out successful, and African Americans were emancipated. But again, all that is positive comes with some negative. Much of the Reconstruction plans failed, and/or caused more bad than good. Blacks continued to be discriminated and looked down upon, but in the end, the country gained freedom for some of its population and set in place cultural and social beliefs that are still used today, as well as impacted the technology and industry that we have today.